All right, so start to wrap up your partner chats. Hopefully you've had a chance to compare notes about your mental markers and see what you had in common, what you might have had slightly different from your partner. I want to take just a minute or two to invite some folks to share out what they came up with, especially if you've got a gesture or a drawing that you would be willing to share. So let's start with the first three. We had some models here for standards 1, 2, and 3, but did anybody come up with anything significantly different for one of these standards that you'd like to share? And now is a great time to just unmute and jump in.
I said TMI for theme and main idea.
TMI, nice. All right, we got an acronym. Hopefully it's not too much information, but that will certainly be memorable. Awesome. All right, what about the rest of the standards 4 through 10? Who came up with something juicy?
I had one for number 10 because as an assistant principal, I deal with 9th and 10th grade, and I'll ask a kid what grade they're in and they'll tell me 10th, and I'll look it up and it'll be like 9th, and I'm like, well, that's because you didn't pass English. So that was my cue to remember is what grade are you in?
Read and comprehend grade level text. What grade are you in? Awesome.
Oh, that's good.
Okay.
So I have a hand signal that I like to use. It kind of, I see it as flowing off of that example for R3 as far as across the course of the text, right? And so you have this across the course of the text, but I kind of do mine a little more jaggedy than like a nice pretty wave, which is very Florida-esque. But so it's like across the course of the text and then words and phrases. So I go from being big and across the whole thing down to small. And that way I'm thinking about the 2 layers.
So you're even thinking, Kimba, about as you progress through the standards, using them in order to help remember, going from across the course of the text, broad, and then narrowing down to analyzing words and phrases in more detail, right?
Yep. And then technically it goes off onto one more. So you have the across the course, words and phrases or language, and then structure. And so I kind of make a little box. And so it's like the hand signals kind of feed into each other, which helps me remember the progression as well.
Nice. Anyone else like to share one or two?
For number 8, I did TACT, and it's to teach, evaluate, and to analyze an argument and claims through a text. So TEACT.
All right, more acronyms. Great.
More acronyms.
So as you can see, there are a lot of different ways that you can approach this. But the point here is, again, just to really internalize these so that you have them available as you're looking at tasks and thinking about alignment, as you're building your own tasks so that you know the standards more deeply. All the time when I'm workshopping tasks with people and we're thinking about adjustments to the focus cluster, I'm able to pull this out and go, you know what? I think standard 6 about point of view might be really helpful here, and it might be a good fit for the work you're asking students to do. So just having them in your mind so solidly as opposed to having to go and look up all the different options all the time comes in handy in a wide assortment of contexts and purposes. So again, whether it's an acronym, a word or phrase, a drawing, a gesture, some combination, whatever it is that helps you internalize these is great. And then you can do this activity with others so that they can internalize them. And when you look back at this activity, when you see the coach instructions for how to do this activity, again, especially if you have people in a room together, you can get people up with their partners and running through all 10 of their mental markers really quickly, doing it, once with the paper in front of them, and then you have to put the paper away and do it all from memory. There's a lot of different ways you can approach it, but it's all about knowing these standards by heart. And that really feeds into the next section for tonight, because we're going to start to think carefully about how these standards show up in task prompts and how they drive the design of tasks. It was such a great experience to read your teaching channel conversations this week again and hear you talk about how coding that student work for evidence of the standards led a lot of you back to thinking about the task itself and how that activity could be a really useful check for task designers to make sure that their task is actually asking students to do the work of the standards, because otherwise you're pretty unlikely to see evidence of those standards in the student work. And the way that we like to think about driving the design of tasks with the standards themselves is with this concept of a cluster of focus standards. So focus standards we really see as this three-legged stool, the three legs that the task rests upon, that balance the task to be driven by reading, writing, and content as appropriate for your grade level and subject area. And these are not just standards that you touch upon in passing over the course of a module. These are really the standards that directly drive the thinking work that students will do in the module and the evidence that students will produce of their mastery of those standards in their final products. So I want to walk through a few examples of tasks and model the activity that you all will be doing in a few moments here, which is going to be very similar to what we did last week with student work. We're going to be coding task prompts themselves for explicit connections to the focus standards that drive them. And we hope in the course of this process that you'll also start to see and think about how reading, writing, and content can really support each other in driving a coherent task that has balance across those three domains. So I'm going to begin with a ninth grade chemistry task. I know we're in high school science again, which some of you were not comfortable with as we were talking about the student work last time. But as always, we have multiple examples in different grade levels and subject areas, and you can use whichever one is the most appropriate for your context. But we're going to start here with a task that uses the reading standard of RST2 from the Common Core. That's our central ideas, right? And in this case, also tracing a text explanation of a complex process, phenomenon, or concept. The content standard here comes from this task author's local context, and it's analyze a major global challenge to specify qualitative and quantitative criteria and constraints for solutions that account for societal needs and wants. And this is an argumentative writing task. So their writing standard is to write arguments focused on discipline-specific content. So you can see this person is using the history, science, and technical subjects version of these standards to drive the work of their task. And here's the task prompt, which in just a moment I'm going to show you with the codes for these three standards. Should electrical energy be generated from nuclear power or fossil fuels? After reading informational texts on how electrical energy is generated from these fuels, write an essay in which you compare the chemistry behind the two methods to generate electricity and argue which is the better method for production of electricity in an urban environment. Support your position with evidence from the texts and be sure to consider competing views. So there's multiple things going on in this task, but we're going to start by looking for evidence of that reading standard. So the reading standard is asking students to trace a text explanation or depiction of a complex process, phenomenon, or concept. Here you really see that showing up in the task in this portion of what the informational texts are about. They're reading informational texts on how electrical energy is generated from these fuels, and then they're comparing the processes that are used. So they're really hitting this part of the reading standard. Looking down to the content standard, we have this idea about criteria and constraints for solutions to problems. Here we have the problem of what's an appropriate method of electricity production, specifically in an urban environment. So we've got some of those constraints. They're arguing for a solution, which is the better method. And then as we come down to the writing standard, write arguments focused on discipline-specific content, you can see that popping up in several different places within the task prompt. So you've got that cognitive demand to argue. You've got the request to be sure to consider competing views, which is part of writing an argument on discipline-specific content. In this case, even the comparison feeds into that argument because they're looking at both sides equally and then they're staking a claim about which one is most appropriate. So the comparison feeds into the argument here. So this is just one example of how you can actually see evidence of these standards directly in the task prompt and what is being asked of students so that you can feel much more confident that what students produce is going to yield evidence of their understanding and development of these particular standards. Really quickly, I wanted to go through one more example to look in a completely different domain. So we have a 4th grade ELA example here. And one thing I want to highlight is that sometimes when you think about that 3-legged stool of a focus cluster for English language arts, it can look a little different than it does in the content area, because ELA doesn't have content standards right now in the same sense that other disciplines do. So sometimes in an ELA task, that 3rd leg of content is going to be occupied either by a 2nd reading standard, so you can really get some powerful intersections of 2 reading standards that support one another, or it could be a language standard or something similar. In this case, we have a reading standard. This is our R3, that development. At the grade level 4, it's all about describing a character in depth. We also have a language standard as the content, about understanding figurative language. And then finally, this time for the writing mode, we have informational explanatory. So we've got that writing standard W2 from the Common Core. So once again, if you look at the prompt, you can actually see some of the specific language of the standards coming through right in the task prompt itself. After reading chapter 7 of Phineas L. McGuire Gets Slimed, write a literary analysis in which you explain how Francis O'Rourke Dowell uses one character's thoughts, words, and actions to convey the character's traits to the reader. Support your response with evidence from the texts, and include examples of the author's use of speech style and figurative language to convey your message to readers. So once again, you can really see thoughts, words, and actions. That language is coming straight out of the standard. Conveying the character's traits connects to describe in depth a character. So in some cases, the specific language of the standard, in other cases, sort of a paraphrase of what the standard is asking for. For content, we've got the understanding of figurative language. That comes through in this task in the additional demand to include the examples of the author's use of speech style and figurative language. And if you're not familiar with this text, the main character and some of his friends all have really distinctive ways of speaking. They use a lot of hyperbole and similes and things like that to talk about their world. So it's a good fit with this text to think about how figurative language actually shows aspects of the characters. And then finally, again, the writing standard. You've got a literary analysis, which is typically an explanatory product. You've got the cognitive demand to explain, that connects to the standard, and the idea of conveying your message to readers. So you have convey ideas and information clearly right there in the standard. So again, these are just a couple of examples of looking at a task and being able to clearly see the standards that are driving the thinking work that students are being asked to do in that task. And it's a balanced demand with reading, writing, and content. So as you work with each other on developing and giving feedback on tasks, as you begin to work with teachers, being able to identify the standards, or in some case, identify where there's a mismatch or a misalignment between the identified standards and the task prompt, will be a really key tool in your belt. So we're going to ask you now to do the work. Again, the goal is to be able to do this quickly at a glance, to really be able to connect the language of the standards to the language of the task prompt. And we're going to ask you to open up the task coding activity. It's linked in several places. It's here on the slide. It's in the syllabus. And if I know Megan, it's happening in the chat right now. And what we're going to ask you to do is open up that document. And it should be a read-only Google Doc. So just like last week, we're not starting from Core Tools this time, but you're going to want to work in your own copy of this document. So you have 2 ways to do that. You can either download this as a Word document and open it separately, or if you're comfortable working in Google, you can make a copy of this document for yourself and work there. In this document, you have 4 different options. We've got a couple of different grade levels and content areas represented, so you can choose those that are more comfortable and familiar to you, or you can challenge yourself and try something outside of your content zone. But we're going to ask you to try to take at least 2 of these 4 examples and do some color coding, similar to what we did last week, just like what I just showed you in the slides, to try to point out the connections between the reading, writing, and content standards and the language of the task prompt. You can either highlight or change the text color, whatever is comfortable for you. But the idea is that you are coding these task prompts for where you see the 3 focus standards at play. And we're going to give you just shy of 10 minutes. And once again, I'm just going to pause and ask for any clarifying questions. I know it's going to take you a minute too, just to get to the document, make your copy, and process everything I just said. So let's just take a moment. So as we move on, and please feel free to continue popping ideas into the chat, I see some common threads in the conversation here, mainly that this is just another case where it's all about alignment. This activity is really here to think about tight alignment between the standards and then what we're asking students to do through task prompt, and then hopefully what we see evidence of in the student work. So all the way through from the input to the output. But I also like to think about the language that we use to talk about the relationship between the standards and the task, because so often we talk about it as meeting the standard or aligning to the standard, almost in a compliance way, like retroactively seeing if the task is relating to the standards. It's sometimes helpful to change the language we use and the way we think about it, to think about the focus standards actually driving the design and the use of the task, as well as the instruction that then follows in the classroom. And it's a really subtle difference, but I think it can make a difference in the way that we talk about and think about our work with tasks. And that's why we are actually going to ask you to start with standards. So you will actually be selecting focus standards that you want to work on, and then building your task from those standards to ensure that the standards are driving the design of the task, as opposed to coming up with the task idea and then retroactively thinking about what standards apply. So to support you in that work of selecting focus standards as the starting point of your design process for your own tasks and modules, I want to introduce you very briefly to a tool that you're going to have at your fingertips for your own design work and for your coaching work. I skipped a couple of slides, but I think I said the key points here. The idea of these focus standards is that, again, they actually drive the design of your task so that you guide the content with which students will grapple, you identify how students will read the text and glean information and insight from the text, and focus on how students will organize their writing. And ultimately, that's for the purpose of identifying the learning that students will engage in and that students will produce evidence of that a teacher can see in the final product. And it all comes back to the idea of alignment. We're going to be talking mostly here in Blended Foundations about the alignment of the task to the standards, so that it's actually representing the thinking work that students need to do to enact the standard. Later on in our journey together, we're going to be thinking all the way through the instructional ladder, the skills, the mini tasks, the evidence, and the formative assessments. And it will all be about this question of alignment. So again, briefly, one tool that I'm going to just touch upon tonight and then we'll come back to in more depth next week is a starter task. And we have a collection of these starter tasks that we're going to ask you to peruse between now and next week. And all they are examples of discipline-specific tasks that clearly are driven by a focus cluster of standards, and in particular have clear evidence of a reading standard. and they are annotated to support you or others in adapting the task to their local context by swapping out the content or text. The reason that we find these starter tasks to be useful is that there are a lot of decision points that go into designing an LDC task. This is just a quick, you don't even need to read through this, but just looking at the color coding here that's used for a different purpose, you can see all the different decisions that go into designing a task. You've got your text, your writing product, your cognitive demand, your content, all of these different things. And sometimes that can be a lot to grapple with, especially as for newer designers. The starter task is just designed to reduce those decision points so that the reading and writing standards are really hardwired into the task prompt, and you can switch out the text or topic to customize it to a content standard that's appropriate for your setting. The starter tasks also have annotations. These are just little notes that explain the rationale that went on in the original design of the task. That makes it easier to think about how to use the task, how to swap things out and adapt it for your own purposes. And they are tagged to the tasks right there within a collection in Core Tools. So we have a link to the starter task collection in the syllabus. And I'm going to move on from this idea now because it's really something, again, to talk about more next week when we think about designing. But I just wanted to make you aware of this resource as you're thinking about focus standards and what's out there to help you envision what a task with a focus cluster of reading, writing, and content could look like. These starter tasks might be a good place for you to do that. For us here tonight, we are actually going to begin the process of making the first key decisions that will drive the design of your module. And we are going to do this. You all have the unique and special situation of being able to build from the good work that has already been done in your district in the form of your curriculum blueprints. So I'm going to invite Andrea to talk for just a few minutes about how and why we are going to make some of these design decisions in relation to the curriculum blueprint. And then I am going to really bring it home with your next steps for session 3 next week. So Andrea, I'm going to go ahead and leave this slide up on the screen, but we'd love to hear from you a little bit.
Okay. Hopefully you guys can hear me. And I love what is being shared in the chat. Because Barb, yes, I'm one of those people who wrote a teaching task from scratch, and I think some of my colleagues online with us did as well. And actually the starter tasks weren't available way back when. So on that note, Nicole and Barb, help me out here whenever I start to go off on a rabbit trail, just pull me back. You guys, what we are going to do is we are going to partner and we are going to look specifically at some grade levels and some subject areas that will be our focus as we begin to look at tasks or us writing a task or potentially using a starter task. And are we going to go with R13 as our reading standard?
We are, and Andrea, I have a little more detail about that on the subsequent slides. So if you can just sort of frame the idea of the commonality there, then we can dig in a bit on the details.
Okay. So you guys, what we would like to do is actually, let's see if I can give you a visual image. Thinking about our blueprints in ELA, social studies, and science. We are looking at targeting a reading standard and a writing standard across the board so that those standards would be supported in science and social studies. We're looking to see where starter tasks could potentially fit in our curriculum blueprints. Not necessarily would they all be taught in first quarter or second quarter or third quarter, but it's looking at focusing on a specific reading standard. Does that make sense?
So
yes.
I think it does. And so as coach certification candidates, everybody will be developing a task and then eventually a skills listed instructional ladder to earn your task authorship badge and your ladder authorship badge. So of course we want to design something that's going to be for the greater good, and also do a little bit of learning and experimenting together. As one of the things Andrea and folks have really been talking about is, how can we provide some more good examples so that we don't have all those blood, sweat, and tears at key places in your blueprint? So as you are working and working with other teachers over the course of the proposed Summer Institute and beyond, that we can begin to think about ways to be really strategic. I kind of think about it as if anybody can remember Arnold Schwarzenegger in Kindergarten Cop, where he's just being run over. Sometimes I have dreams like that about modules, where all my former modules are just like chasing me, you know, they're all over the place. And so we need to dust some off, we need to let some go, and design only where we need to and for the greatest good. You know, it used to be you just kind of made one to make one. So we're really trying to look at, this is the lead group, and thinking about how we can approach artfully what we take and adapt and what we make. And so we're going to do a little bit of work throughout the coach-certification process that then we hope to expand as you work with teachers.
Absolutely.
See, y'all didn't need me to say this. You did a great job.
I'm listening to your words. So Nicole, give us the nitty-gritty next steps.
All right. So as you all begin this process of designing your first task, and not necessarily your first task ever for some of you, but your first task for the purpose of this coach certification journey, like Andrea and Barb said, we have agreed to hold a few things in common for this whole cohort. Everybody's going to be using the reading standard R1.3, which is that development standard. And that can take many different forms for your specific grade level and content area, but we'll all be focusing on R3. This will really allow us to see the commonalities and differences at different grade levels and content areas. All of us are also going to use a common writing mode of informational explanatory. And that gives you some flexibility in which standard you could choose. There's, of course, the umbrella informational explanatory writing standard of 1.2. Other standards that lend themselves well to this are 2.4, which is great for cases where you might be using a writing product other than an academic essay, thinking about development that's appropriate to task, audience, and purpose. And 3.7 and 3.8 are really great for tasks where you might want students to engage more in research than in close analysis of a single text. So there is some flexibility there in which particular writing standard you use, but all of us will be using the writing mode of informational explanatory. And then each design pair, and I'll talk in just a moment about the pairings that we have for you, will select a content standard to round out that three-legged stool of the focus standards cluster. And the way we're going to ask you to do this is to go right into the curriculum blueprints and identify content that would be a logical fit for this common reading standard and this writing mode. So what content does it make sense to think about development of ideas or sequence of events and to produce an informational explanatory writing piece? We have for you a couple of assignments of design partners that you're going to be working with. And surprise, you've already met your partner tonight because it's the same person that you chatted with after the standards mental marker activity. So again, if you go to the link for design partners, which I'm going to ask Megan to pop into the chat, you can see your pairings here. So you would go horizontal. And then in the second tab of this same spreadsheet, we have put together a sign-up sheet. And I know it looks a little crazy right now, but the idea is that we have the different content areas across the top and the different grade levels down the side, as well as the 4 quarters. We have grayed out some areas that are not priorities for our design. All of the areas that are open cells in white are areas where we know there is a need for some design. We have people planning to come to the Summer Institute to do some work in these grade levels and content areas. And they are places where we can begin to create modules that will actually fill a need in the curriculum and can be taught in this coming year. So your task between now and next week will be to chat with your partner. And I'm going to give you a moment right at the end here just to try to find a time when you can meet with your partner so you can collaborate. And you're going to think about, where are we comfortable in terms of grade level and subject area? And we've tried to pair you through Andrea's guidance according to some commonalities in the hopes that it will make it easy for you to work together. But you can look at this task design sign-up sheet. There's also a summary down here of the grades and go, we together would probably be most suited to thinking about 4th grade ELA, perhaps. So once you identify that, you're going to look to that 4th grade ELA blueprint, try to figure out where in the year it would make sense to do R3, informational explanatory writing, and figure out what that 3rd standard should be.
And Nicole, just to pop in and clarify something in the chat, we are looking at this because this isn't the only thing you're doing the year. We are looking at using RI rather than RL 1.3 so that we can have common conversations. And well, it's something kids need to do. So it may be something. So of course you're going to do RL 1.3 in your year if you're an ELA teacher, but this was something that allowed us to cut across content areas for this first example.
Exactly. Thanks, Barb. So once you and your partner have, see, we've got some folks signing up already. Once you've identified generally what the grade level and content area is that you'd like to focus on, you'll need to do that work of going into the blueprint and figuring out, whether quarter 1, 2, 3, or 4 is the most logical place for a module with that focus. And then that will allow you to sign up in the appropriate box on this form. If you're curious, we don't have a lot of time to go into this right now, but one thing that we have provided for you is our Common Core Standards booklet, recognizing that there are some subtle differences in the words and annotation of your Florida standards. What this can be useful for is looking at a single standard in one place across all grade levels and both text types. So typically it's hard to see them next to each other, but here, for example, you could see standard R1.3 all the way down K through 12. So you could think about what's unique about R1.3 at my grade level and what will I want to focus on then in a task that is specifically for that grade level. So that's a resource that's available to you. And again, this step of meeting with your design partner and identifying your cluster of 3 focus standards that you want to use to drive your task design work in the next few weeks is really the most important work that we have for you between tonight and next week. As usual, in the next steps, there are a couple of other components. We do want you to go into Core Tools and just explore other examples and tools that will help you when you do come to your design process. We've got the starter task collection. We also have a few collections of rated curriculum from other places that might be useful to you as models as you're thinking about building a task from focus standards. We have the Rankin County collection from Mississippi representing grades 6 through 12, and the R.L. Stevenson collection from right there in Florida representing grades K through 6. So you can check those out to see more examples of standards-driven tasks. And then, of course, we have our teaching channel assignment to post at least once and reply to 2 colleagues thinking about questions very similar from last week. What resonated with you from tonight's work, and how could you use the standards mental markers or task coding activities with others? But again, just to reiterate one more time, the really key step this week in getting towards building your own task will be to determine the focus standards that you will use to design your model using the guidelines that we just laid out. So I know we're at time, but I know we also just threw a lot of directions your way. So I want to just pause and provide some space and opportunity for clarifying questions, for wonderings that you have as you launch into your work for session 3 next week.
I'm hearing some folks saying they can't, that the link is not working. Could you double check that?
Yes, let me see.
And could you go back to slide 30?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the slide. Oh no, it's not slide 30, slide 29. Okay. So you have with your design partner, You're going to look at the blueprints, folks. You've got a reading and writing standard identified, and you're looking for, if you're looking at ELA, you're looking for one more reading standard potentially. That may actually come more through the text. You know, you may change that a couple times. You're thinking about which quarter when you sign up and doing a little exploration. Is that right, Kimba?
Yep, that is correct.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And as always, these steps are there for you in the teaching channel. So if you go to our group and you go to week 3, decide when to teach the module and select focus standards. Again, these steps are laid out for you here in terms of what we were asking you to do between now and next week. There's a link to the sign-up sheet right there, and you can always have a refresh of what we're asking you to do.
Okay.
All right, folks, as always, we will stick around for any questions. If you haven't yet, you might want to just send a quick chat to your partner to try to find a time when you can talk through and explore these ideas together this week. And we are so excited that we are launching this process. It's time to get our hands dirty and do some designing. This is the fun part. So thanks again for your engagement and attention tonight, and we will see you next week.
Andrea, I still think you should come up with something for Seth to have to do that nobody else has to do.
I'm beginning to take this personally.
Yeah.
Right? And he loves you, Barb.
Well, I know. And I'm actually online, or I'm on the phone with Amy Cockcroft because she's like, is Seth online? And I'm like, And so it's like, how do I answer her and talk to all of y'all at the same time?
Look, don't be lying to your boss.
Oh my God.